Putin put to the test. Vladimir Putin rules Russia with an iron fist, and his grip on power is undeniable. Recently, however, due to falling oil prices and unprecedented sanctions by the West, some are questioning his ability to hold on. While Putin and his supporters argue that sanctions have been unsuccessful, critics suggest they've caused considerable damage to the Russian economy. So what's the truth? A recent retrospective study by Russia reveals that sanctions have had a significant impact on Russia's economy, except for its petroleum business. As a result of above-average hydrocarbon income, it was anticipated that the Russian economy would only decrease by 2% in 2022. This achievement represents a victory for Russia over most critics' forecasts issued in the last year. However, as oil prices continue to decline, the situation might shift and Putin's regime might be put in jeopardy. Hi, and welcome back to another video of Finance Sense, where we cover all the latest trends in the financial markets and the economy. Before we start, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click on the notification bell to stay updated with our videos. Following the imposition of unprecedented sanctions against Russia by the West a year ago, two schools of thought have formed very quickly. The first school of thought, supported by Putin and the Kremlin, asserts that the economic sanctions imposed by the West have been entirely unsuccessful. They argue that this is shown by the fact that the ruble has grown stronger and that Russia's economy has contracted less than was anticipated. This has been one of Putin's go-to talking points in the past, and he has even called the Western sanctions absurd measures aimed at those without the ability to read or write. The second school of thought, advocated by some hawkish American critics, and at times by Western leaders, holds that Russia is simply lying about its economic performance figures and that sanctions are, in fact, harming the Russian economy. This view is supported by the fact that the Russian central bank stopped releasing most of its data at the start of the war and that some industries, like the Russian car industry, have gone under. But a new retrospective study conducted by the Russia Group, a network of Russian experts that includes former top leaders from Russia's finance ministry and central bank, suggests that the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. Although sanctions have had a significant impact on what we might refer to as Russia's real economy, this impact was masked and countered by Russia's higher-than-average hydrocarbon revenues, which the Kremlin used to fill in the economic gaps in the country. Despite the fact that Russia's petroleum business appears to be doing well, sanctions have had a significant negative impact on the country's economy in areas that are not directly or indirectly supported by the hydrocarbon industry. For instance, financial assets worth over $200 billion flowed out of Russia into the rest of the globe last year as a result of the unprecedented sanctions imposed by the West, which accounted for 12% of the country's GDP. Normally, this would be an economic catastrophe, but owing to its massive oil revenue, the Russian economy was able to withstand the storm. In addition, the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air in Helsinki found that in the first 100 days after the invasion, energy exports from Russia reached a record high of about 93 billion euros, which is an increase of 20% from the same period in the previous year. This is equivalent to roughly 930 million euros per day, over 100 million euros more than the daily 840 million euros that Russia reportedly spent on the invasion. And the reason is that, although the volume of exports has declined, mainly as a result of the EU reducing its purchases by 23%, the volume has only really decreased quite a little, primarily as a result of China and India making up the gap. And with the Russian economy only expected to contract by 2% in 2022, thanks to these above-average hydrocarbon revenues, Russia triumphed over even the most dire predictions for the previous year. Now, before we move on, it is important to note a few important disclaimers. To begin, it's essential to remember not to take these figures at face value. The Russian Statistics Office was strangely slow to share these numbers, and a big chunk of Russia's GDP will go to producing military equipment, a lot of which will be wrecked in the near future on the battlefield. However, this does not necessarily imply that the energy sanctions imposed by the West have been completely pointless. After all, it is essential to note that the price of Russian oil is now roughly 20% lower than the worldwide benchmark. This is due to the fact that Russia is unable to sell its oil to the majority of the Western world, and the oil price ceiling imposed by the G7 has made it more expensive to export oil to nations outside of the G7. However, the fact that Russian oil was trading for over $60 at the beginning of April, above the price ceiling, shows that the system as a whole isn't functioning quite as well as the West had hoped. It's also likely that sanctions-related supply chain disruption has materially raised oil prices to Russia's advantage. The Russian and Soviet economies have always operated in this fashion. Despite the fact that sanctions hurt Russia's real economy, they had little impact on hydrocarbon revenues, which supported the Kremlin. Things go well when the price of oil is high and poorly when it is low. The ambitious Soviet Union's entry into Afghanistan in 1979 was anticipated by high oil prices. However, when the Soviet Union fell apart, oil prices were low. When oil prices rose again in the early years of Putin's presidency, he became more popular and felt emboldened to invade Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022. And perhaps it was for this reason that John McCain once referred to Russia as a gas station masquerading as a country. All of this raises the issue of why the West's energy sanctions did not succeed. Well, one reason is that energy sanctions caused a global price increase. For instance, the West started acquiring liquefied natural gas, or LNG, on international markets after it stopped purchasing natural gas from Russia. In turn, this increased the price of LNG, allowing Russian energy businesses to sell their LNG for more money. As a result, at least in certain instances, Russian energy corporations saw a financial benefit from the sanctions. In general, however, energy sanctions were ineffective because people desperately wanted oil and gas. Even if you impose bans on imports of hydrocarbons, particularly oil, importers will often find a way around the restrictions as they are the raw materials of the contemporary economy. Unfortunately, this implies that the only effective method for the West to undermine Putin's war strategy and the Russian economy is to reduce the price of oil. So, how are they able to pull this off? Historically, the US-Saudi partnership has allowed the West to have an influence on global oil prices. Saudi Arabia has a significant impact on oil prices since it is the largest producer of oil in the world, the head of OPEC, and the only so-called swing producer, or the only nation with the ability to swiftly raise and reduce output. In the past, the US was able to persuade Saudi Arabia to increase or decrease production as they desired, since it was a country's primary security partner in a geopolitically unstable region. Sadly, the West has watched the US-Saudi ties drastically worsen under the Biden administration. Throughout the campaign, Biden criticized the Saudis for the dubious record on human rights violations and threatened to declare them a pariah state. Saudi Arabia has consistently reduced output since Biden took office in an effort to raise prices and strengthen their ties with Putin. The West, particularly the Biden administration, is now faced with a challenging situation. To repair the US-Saudi relationship, should they put aside their human rights objections and risk diplomatic humiliation? Or do they keep criticizing the Saudis, even if it aids Putin in Ukraine? This may end up being a critical choice in the conflict. It will determine if Putin's economy can endure while being made far from the front lines of the war. It would appear that this video has come to an end. Thank you for watching this far. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe, give it a like, and comment below with your thoughts on what you've seen so far. This is Finance Sense, here to help you stay updated on all the most recent developments in the world's economies and financial markets. Have a nice day, and we'll see you in the next video.